Do you see this player? I mean, they should have known that there was something wrong with this Minecraft world if this is what it looks like when you first spawn in. There's an infinite number of normal looking spawn points for a normal single player world, and this is not one of them. But to really analyze this, the fog implies that the player is potentially on a much higher level than the player could ever typically spawn at, but the player decides to relog and all of a sudden everything goes back to what you would expect from a player starting on a world. 9 videos were sent to me by this random Discord user, but as an ARG YouTuber, this is far from out of the ordinary, and I always run these links through a virus checker just to make sure that no one's trying to play some hacker simulator on my computer. And for the first time ever, the link came back as malicious. So how did I end up with these videos? Well, I did some research into anywhere else this virus has been online, and I discovered a Minecraft forum, which led me down a rabbit hole into finding one of the oldest and most unknown mysteries of the game. The player starts to build a small dirt house before logging off inside the house. I make note of this because in the very next log, when they log on again, we can see that they are no longer in that location. The world is broken in some places, and if you're wearing headphones, you're actually probably noticing that there's this monotonous noise in the background that's hard to understand but is going back and forth from the left to right ear. They instead log out, presumably thinking they went on the wrong world, and log back in exactly where they should have been. I guess a win is a win, and they end up just playing as normal for a bit, but things quickly get unnormaled when we hear followed by but they don't see anything in the direction of the noise, so they decide to take a step back, look at their lovely house that they've finished, and log off. Now, going back to that speaking from before, it's nearly impossible to make out what these voices are saying with zero reference, but what intrigues me is how it shifts from the left to right ear. It appears to be almost a sort of conversation, and when I map it out, we can see the left and right side go up and down, almost like waves flowing back and forth. And I analyzed these patterns for meaning, but I couldn't find much. We log on to see that the world has changed and there is now cobblestone in every direction. The player punches the wall, but it appears to be very, very thick. So they make their way down and discover more of the maze. They continue wandering with their only point of reference being the stars above them, actually more so the lack thereof, but they make note of some shadows on the ground as well as some of the shapes of the room being weird. But I want you guys to try to guess what the puzzle is here, because this is one of the best puzzles I've ever seen in one of these things. Are you ready? Basically, if you track the player as they go through the maze through a sort of top-down view, we can start to see the maze layout, and as it happens, a very hazy message starts to form. Now, sketching this was incredibly difficult, tedious, and other words that just mean I'm lazy, but I tried to make it as accurate as possible and ended up with this. You probably can't tell what this is trying to say, so allow me to separate it for you. Okay, not much better. But let me take this section by section. This first word is certainly the word hi. That's quick and easy. This, however, I don't really know. I see a T, an R, and a G maybe, but this is certainly the word you, so that helps. And then finally, this is either there or here, but that's neither here nor there. But the issue with having so many unknowns is we get a lot of potential solutions to what this sentence could be saying. So let's get rid of some of the variables here and just say that it either is hi, you here, or hi, you there. Besides this message being one step away from like a late night text from your ex-boyfriend, it seems to me that the world is trying to talk to us in the only way that it knows how. And in the meantime, we just have this player who's all too focused on escaping this labyrinth. They continue wandering around before suddenly hearing a all too familiar noise and getting spooked right out of the game. We log on no longer in that bizarre maze, but also not anywhere familiar. And it's important to note that according to the timestamps, the player has now started to upload these videos to the forum, and the occasional person is chiming in to help them almost troubleshoot what's happening to their world. The player says in chat, new location 3, the forest, before continuing to walk through the trees. We can see that the people on the forum have begun to categorize the spots found thus far. Location 1 was the original base, location 2 is called the maze, and now this forest. Also on the forum, we can see that someone there recommended trying to do F3 and A to reload the chunks around them just to see what happens. So they do exactly that. The player is now stuck in this mass of bedrock with no way to escape it. It doesn't seem like the world is taking very kindly to this cheat of sorts, so the player tries to quickly reload the chunks a few more times to get out of this location, but it doesn't work. We can see other places for just like a split second, and then it's right back to this empty prison, so the player has no choice but to log off. We log on once again to see that the world has changed, and this time we're in a location that we haven't quite seen before. The player writes in chat giving the location a pretty apt name, which is the Distorted Plains. It has sort of a semblance of a plains biome, but with like short tree stubs and some leaves. We walk through this area for quite a while, and I can notice that some of these trees and leaves are different heights, different widths, but other than that, there really seems to be no rhyme or reason to what's happening here. For the first time ever, the player actually seems to find the end of this biome or this area and continues into what looks like a normal looking forest. They continue going through here until they find a large cobblestone structure. This place is really interesting to me because you can see at one point that there are these trees that are cut horizontally, and I did some research into this type of glitch. And funny enough, I see a lot of trees that get glitched, but they're always cut vertically and never horizontally. The player continues exploring, kind of just getting a bearing for the area and what it has to offer until they hear a familiar noise again. But then something else happens. Here's the thing, I liked the player. I thought that they were playing pretty logically and were definitely trying to gather as much information as possible. But this time they log on and randomly have a torch on the ground. That's interesting, but they continue to look through what seems to be that same forest from before, and then randomly decide to leave the game and log back on. Why on planet Earth would they do this? We had the chance to get our bearings in this forest, maybe see if there was any connections to the other places, but instead, we log back on inside of the bedrock structure, but this time there's a boat just in range for the player to grab and escape in. I'm not sure if this is some sort of peace offering from the world, because we've really never seen the world be kind towards the player, which sort of makes me feel like this could be another person somehow, but this is the first time we get a full view of this bedrock catastrophe that the player decides to call Purgatory. The walls are made up of pure bedrock and have very interesting patterns along all of the sides. The player very quickly sort of figures out how to navigate inside them, and for the first time says something not merely about the location. We can assume that the player is talking to the people on the forum, but I just like this moment because the player doesn't typically let us in on what they're thinking about. As the player roams around, we hear that seemingly a bit closer this time, and the wall seems to change a little bit, maybe starting to thin out, but out of nowhere, the player says, "Gotta go. I know it's a little time." And they leave the game, which is so frustrating to me because while they seem like they didn't want to, it feels like every time this happens, we lose all of our progress. And with such short glimpses, it's nearly impossible to actually figure out what's happening here. I did catch one thing, however. These symbols seem to actually be vaguely reminiscent of runes. Runes were and are used to sort of gain meaning and understanding of the world, so why not use them to gain some understanding of this world? Now, the thing with runes is many of them are very simple shapes, so I could be wrong here, but I see one here that looks like the rune for strength, another one here looks like the rune for danger, and then these could potentially be the runes for hope or support. It's hard to tell. We can see that the player on the forum ended up doing some research into terrain generation around the time of this last log being posted. They ended up linking some articles about the far lands and believe the bedrock structure to be similar to them. However, while they were researching that, I was researching these boom sounds that we keep hearing. They sound vaguely reminiscent of like cave noises that are in the game, but they're not quite right. And that's when I realized that they also had a split audio track for the left and right sides. And when you separate those and put them back to back, you hear this. Now, this could be fully a situation where I've convinced myself it's saying something that it's not, but once I heard this, I feel like I couldn't unhear it. And now the world has communicated with us in two separate ways, but the issue is the player has discovered neither of them. So now I'm sort of like, is the world trying to talk to the player, or is it trying to talk to us as the viewer? Well, I decided to take a healthy dose of "You're Not That Guy, Pal" and move on. This next log is a complete outlier from any of the other videos that we've seen thus far, so I'm going to treat it as such. We're finally back at the player's house, although this time it looks just a bit different. This is partially because of the 3D anaglyph setting that is now turned on. If you don't know what that is, essentially in the older versions of Minecraft, they offered a feature where if you had those cliche 3D type glasses, you could wear them and have a 3D Minecraft experience. Well, in this case, it sort of results in this weird sort of glitchy color visuals, and the player says,
"This doesn't feel right. Like too long?"
I can see what the player means. If we turn up the visibility even more, we can see that their house seems to be somewhat stretched, and then there's even a tree from that tall forest that was never there prior, so the player leaves the game. They immediately log on again, and this time the world seems to have trapped them in this sort of bedrock box with layers upon layers of glass. The player seems to not want to leave the game and potentially never see this place again, so they start to break through and maybe try to find a means to escape. They break to the next level, but don't see much there, so they continue dropping until they reach the bottom. Well, actually almost the bottom, because there's a single piece of glass with water beneath it. And when they go into that, they try to swim around and find any interest or escape there, but they find nothing. And when they go back up for air, they realize there's no actual way to get back out of here, and they are forced to leave the game. We log on again, where this tube of bedrock has gotten no less colder than the last time we saw it. The player actually reports to us and says,
"This one is my least favorite."
You know, something gave it away. I don't know if it was getting permatrapped in bedrock or calling the place purgatory, but we continue on and we end up discovering that at the end of this, we can see a dense forest where the player decides to write,
"Note, purgatory connects to the forest."
We finally have some sort of connection here between two of these places, but as the player gets closer to the inside of this forest, the frame rate seems to dramatically drop, where we can briefly open up F3 and see that something is lagging their computer until all of a sudden the game crashes. The player boots up the game immediately again and is clearly unhappy. They spawn in the maze this time, aren't happy with that location, so they use F3 and A few times just to, of course, end up back in the bedrock trap, which also isn't to their liking, so they leave the game and rejoin just to spawn in the forest again. This time they find a lava pool and just start chucking all of their items inside. They end up typing in chat,
"If you don't follow your own rules, why should I?"
and log off the world. It is at this point that we must turn back to the forum for a couple of answers. A reply was made by a user that said, quote, "This feels related to QF1." Now, Fun fact about me, I hate it when people say things like they're common knowledge when it couldn't be further from the truth. QF1 didn't give me a lot to research. There's a chance that they were making a rather distasteful joke about a plane crash that happened in 1999 called Qantas Flight 1, but I gave them the benefit of the doubt that that was unrelated, so I dug a little deeper into Minecraft history, and I found a very niche mystery that was going on around the time back in the day regarding a series of images that were posted anonymously. The name QF1 related to the start of a link URL that led to this image. And when this image was released, it was heavily implied that there was more to discover and dive into here. People initially looked for certain things that were out of place, like this shadow or black box covering part of this tree. However, it was quickly made apparent that the thing to find here was this tiny bit of text in the bottom of the image. Upon rewriting the set URL with a set of characters, you would get a new image. And bit by bit, people were discovering image after image until they suddenly hit a wall. This image right here did not seem to have any text that would lead to another image. And you may have noticed already that these images actually make up a bigger image. And upon arranging them properly, you can see this very tall tree that looks comparable to what the player has been seeing in their world. However, no one knew what to do here or if there was even any more to be found. Spoiler alert, there is. And after messing with hues and filters for long enough, I was actually able to find another code in this image, which got me one last image, but dear God, was it a letdown. This offers exactly 0 new information and doesn't even have another code inside of it for me to use. At least I thought that before literally zooming out and seeing the bigger picture. The assembled image prior had formed a sort of upside down T shape, but that very quickly changed when this image was put into its correct place. It now clearly depicted a number 1. But what could that mean? I mean, a single number could be related to absolutely millions of things. But you know what else has millions of things? Minecraft world seeds. Okay, wait, that made it sound like I thought of this immediately. I tried so much other stuff and researched the whole internet before I even thought of this. But the issue here was I had to pick the right version of Minecraft because one Minecraft seed on one version is going to be completely different because of the different updates that happen. But after a couple tries, I ended up finding it, and it is the exact same world that we see the player playing on. So not only was I right about the seed, but also that random person was actually right about these two worlds being connected. But here's the part that makes 0 sense. The correct version wasn't the version that we see the player playing on. They were on 1.4.2, but that version gives me a completely different world than the one that I found it on, which is 1.12. And 1.12 wouldn't come out for another 5 years from when these videos were posted. And before you ask, no, this world did not have all those weird structures. However, it did have a forest nearby that actually looked comparable to what I see in this image. And I tried to look for any signifying features in the image that would help me sort of track it down. And that's when I saw this. It's a lava particle, which means the person was standing probably close by to a lava pool. But I couldn't actually find any lava pools in this world. I did find a small pool of water, and after removing this one tree, I found this location that actually seemed semi-close to what we see in the image, but obviously missing the very clear tree in the center of it. I seem to be just missing something else here, so I'll open this part up to you guys in the comments, but it's time we return back to our final log post. We log on, and judging by the date that this was posted to the forum, we can see that a large bit of time has passed from the last time that the player has played. The world has changed again, this time forming into that maze, and the player says,
I regret throwing my stuff out.
This is especially true because the player is now stuck punching through walls of cobblestone the best that they can. They pass through the walls and call attention to the fact that it's always nighttime or raining when they're in the maze location. Eventually, they come across some trees, which allows them to make a pickaxe as well as a boat to sort of get through and navigate a lot faster. The player finds some coal, which they are able to turn into torches and finally escape this cobblestone hell. However, speaking of hell, the player gets in a boat to kind of get away from this area and runs into none other than their favorite place, purgatory. They slowly kind of get their bearings and climb their way into it, and they are actually at one point distracted by a walking noise off to their right. If you don't like dumb horror movie protagonists, you are about to hate to see this guy pull up, but there is a very clear way or path in this direction. They eventually come across this sort of large room, and they take a pause for a while, and I guess try to speak to the world in a physical way that the world could maybe understand it. They spell out, "Hi, are you there?" and sort of wait for a moment, and nothing happens, so they decide to leave the game. This is the first time that we have ever or will ever log back into the same location that we logged off in. And you can tell that the player is just as surprised by it as we are. We eventually get back on track and sort of move deeper into the bedrock mess that is this place. And we eventually find a familiar opening and slowly make our way down to the area that the player has become far too familiar with. Something is off, and the player notices it. I mean, the last that the player left, they left behind a boat, presumably in case they ever got stuck there again. But that boat was no longer there. These videos, while definitely a bit weird, come together to tell two different stories. One is of a person who is struggling to understand and deal with a world that is always changing to try and trap and to try to kill them. But in actuality, the videos are out of order. Every single log off location that we see aligns with another log on location and vice versa. This player had become so obsessed with finding the meaning and the symbolism of the world that's around them that they forgot to actually look at themselves for once. The player logs on again, this time spawning just outside of the tall forest, and they walk forward and eventually reach their original house, but there's one more gap that the player has to fill in, and as they do that, they talk directly to us.
Sorry for the wild goose chase. I guess this world wasn't what I thought it was. I still really enjoyed it.
Sure, this player got distracted trying to find meaning in every little thing inside this world, but if the player found meaning in that, does it really matter whether or not it was real? Like, some people find meaning in angels. Others find it in a speck of dirt. You are the player. Wake up!